Sayada's words.
Good evening. It's great to see you. So I came in with my robes and talked to Ellen, and she suggested that I could go change in room 10, and I took the elevator up. Yes. And got out of the elevator, walked into room 10, and standing in the doorway of room 10, I burst into tears. The Tommy, all the books, the Buddha on the altar, it was great. Because I stored my robes in there for years, so I have this deeply ingrained, embodied memory of walking in the door to change into my robes in room 10. So it was some kind of palpable relief or something really sweet. So that's not really what I'm going to talk about, although it's related, right? So there's two cases in the middle of the Blue Cliff record, 49 and 50. They're right in the middle, and it hadn't occurred to me until recently that maybe they're in the middle for a reason, but they both have to do with, essentially with big ideas and rice. So the first one is, 49 is, Sansheng asks Shui Feng, he says, hey, so when the golden fish escapes the net, what does he eat? And Shui Feng says, I'll tell you when you're out, just wait till you're out of the net, I'll tell you when you get out. And Sansheng says, what? You have 1,500 students and you don't even get the point enough to, tell me an answer? And Shui Feng says, I'm an old guy and it's really a lot of work running a monastery, basically. So that's one, right? And if we're talking about big ideas, the big idea there is somehow that it's useful to imagine yourself as a fish who's caught in a net, right? And that there's some direction you can swim or trick you can do to escape the net, right? If there was ever a dualistic Buddhist idea, that's one, right? But anyway, so the next one is even more explicit. So a monk asks, young man, what is that's in Clary it's translated every atom samadhi, right? Adam, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Adam might not be exactly right in it. The character says something slightly different, but in any case, Yunmen says, rice in the bowl, water in the bucket. Right? And here again, there's a guy who's done enough reading and probably needed to be reading to get the notion that there's this mental state called every atom samadhi, which I'll describe a bit later as well, but which is pretty phantasmagorical, basically. And he's asking about it, and he's asking, probably one of the most famous Zen masters ever, and a guy who's constantly getting asked questions like this. And in all the koans, he answers them in this really brief, poetic, kind of minimalist way, like, rice in the bowl, water in the bucket. But interestingly, in the commentaries, they have a bunch of rants by Yun Men where he'll say things like, "What the hell do you mean every samadhi?" And he just goes off, right? He doesn't necessarily say that about this particular question, but there's a whole bunch of other sort of standard way out there big idea questions that he responds to by saying, like, does knowing the answer to this question do you any good when he says stuff like, buying meat at the local butcher and using the roadside latrine, basically, right? So anyway, but in this case, he decides to do the minimalist answer, right? Okay, so in order to continue this talk, I need to make a claim about the fundamentals of Buddhism, right? And in order to say that, you have to have a preamble of some sorts, and the preamble kind of goes like this, right? Basically, the history of Buddhism and the history of the ideas in Buddhism is just, the more you study it, the more murky it is, basically, right? The claim that we know anything that the Buddha actually said is based on an assumption that's so wildly impossible that hardly any modern day scholars take it seriously, right? There are some people who sort of backfill and say, well, it was an oral tradition, right? Yeah, of course it was an oral tradition, and that's a marvelous thing. And we all know that all through the era when Buddhism was developing, and also when the other sort of South Asian spiritual traditions were developing, oral traditions were really a big deal. And you get things like the Odyssey, right? And so on, where people memorized extremely long pieces of text, and, well, not even text. I guess you can call them texts in the sort of postmodern sense, right? But you memorize these extremely long things and recited them regularly and so on. But we know that, and that's true. But we also know, by observing those processes all over the world, exactly what happens with them. People make stuff up. Right? They make new stuff up. They change subtly or grossly the text of the thing that they're memorizing because of cultural, economic, or political factors, and so on, right? And so over the course of the hundreds of years that Buddhism developed, until we actually got some stuff that's been written down that we can read, right? Which started happening around the turn of the Common Era, right? Has everybody heard about this? In ancient Gandhara, the Buddhist community was constantly hitting up the incredibly rich people that were benefiting from Silk Road trade and so on and so forth, and saying, you'll do better in your next life if you donate a whole bunch of money to build a stupa and pay a Buddhist scribe to transcribe some text to put it in the stupa, right? And so they did this, and what they wrote them on birch bark. They'd write them on these pretty big pieces of birch bark, because you can roll off a pretty big piece of birch bark, right? And then they'd roll up the piece of birch bark, and usually, not always, but usually the jar that they were putting them in the stupa was too small, And so they would take this roll of birch bark and they'd fold it in half and stuff it into the jar, right? And not surprisingly, the things completely fell apart. And when people started digging them up, and this has been happening for the last, I don't know, 60 or 70 years or something like that, and looked at them, they're like, we can't make head or tail of this. But people started to try, and they would spend ages, sort of steaming and unrolling and steaming and unrolling the pieces that were still rolled up. And then they'd go through this huge pile of little tiny chips and go, well, this one might go here. And what about this one here? And they managed to put together these documents, and they put together a fair number of them now, right? And they are literally the first actual long-form Buddhist documents that we have, right? And not surprisingly, there are documents in there that are like things in the Sanskrit canon and like things in the Pali canon and so on and so forth. But when you look at them and you read all the other stuff as well, right? You get this idea that regardless of the murkiness, right, that Buddhists, at least at that point in history and ever since, have agreed on some fundamentals, right? And the fundamentals are that human suffering and folly arises out of essentially how we're built as humans. And like in the Four Noble Truths, it says grasping, right? But if you dig down in the rest of the canon, it becomes clear that grasping has a mechanism, and that mechanism is built into being human. It's not, we humans can't be human without it. And interestingly, the assumption in some of the documents, there's a great text in the Gandharan, birch bark sutra collection, where this guy is walking down the street. This Brahmin is walking down the street, and he sees somebody sitting under a tree, and he looks really good. In fact, he kind of looks extra good. And the guy walks right up to the other guy and says, wait, are you a god? And the guy goes, no, I'm not a god. He says, well, are you some sort of, like spirit being of some other sort? And the guy goes, no. He says, are you human? He goes, no, I'm not human. And the guy says, well, what are you? And he says, well, I'm a Buddha, of course, right? So the notion was that Buddhas were post-human, right? They weren't human anymore, interestingly enough, right? But in any case, the fundamental idea was that it was possible to transcend, not even transcend, work with that freedom from the suffering and folly that was caused by our humanity, right, was tractable and could be addressed through practices that were easily describable and involved both outward behavior and inner cultivation. So, obey the precepts, practice a kind of self-study. I'm now dressing this up a little bit, but practice a kind of self-study that allows the human self to soften up and leave more space and so on, and then live and enjoy the result, basically. That was the sort of fundamental prescription, right? And let's see, what time is it? There were a lot of problems, complications around that, even at that point, right? So the question was, well, who can do this, right? Well, if you look at the earliest Buddhist documents we've got, it's pretty clear that it's only guys, and maybe even by implication only guys from particular social classes or families, right? And that, and interestingly, it's only guys that are willing to completely drop out of society and not even have any friends. There's all this stuff like, oh my God, you shouldn't be having any friends. They'll just make your life complicated. Right? So there's a whole sutra about that too, that you're supposed to be completely and utterly solitary. Right? So only guys, maybe only maybe Brahmins, right? And only people who are willing to live this extremely renunciate life, right? And even when women were added in as practitioners, and the Lord only knows how that happened. There's a story about it in the Pali Canon, but the overarching assumption that's written all over that set of documents is that even though women can practice and be enlightened, they can't be totally free from suffering and experience parinirvana and be erased from the round of suffering and rebirth and so on, right? They have to be reborn as men, right? So that whole scheme, right, was kicking around in the period before Buddhism sort of jumped into China. And the interesting thing is that it changed a lot when that happened, right? I think the Chinese Buddhists were, none of that stuff about that like extreme renunciate life looks particularly good. It's not how we want to live here. And the idea of purifying your karma to the point where you're completely erased from the universe is not particularly appealing as well. And so we don't want to think about it that way. And they had a number of pre-existing philosophical and sort of spiritual fields of practice that suggested a way that they could kind of modify or tint Buddhism so that it was more of a practice that was possible in China, right? So, I mean, for an example, we can look at the whole notion of samadhi, right? And so remember the first koan, well, actually, no, the second one, the Bunkhastian man. So what's every atom samadhi, right? The notion of samadhi goes way back in the South Asian spiritual traditions. So it's in the Upanishads, not in the Vedas, but in the Upanishads. It's in the Yoga Sutra. It's in the Jainist and Sikh texts. It's in both Mahayana and Theravadan Buddhism, right? Interestingly, in the Pali Canon, it doesn't really appear too many places. It's mainly inside the scheme of levels of practice that are called the jhanas in the Pali Canon, and it's mentioned in the first jhana as a sort of mental state that the primary mark of which is enjoyment, right? So you can kind of enjoy it, right? It's not in the other jhanas, right? It's the enjoyment kind of goes away, but in other South Asian traditions, it's tremendously complicated. There are multiple stages of you know, kind of, they go from sitting around enjoying things to experiencing the entire universe from one side to the other through the eye of God, right? And you know, the whole every atom samadhi. If you look around for every atom samadhi in the Buddhist literature, almost all the references are actually to this case is translated by Thomas Clary, right? And if you look elsewhere, you don't really find it, but it's pretty clear it's from the Avatamsaka Sutra, and the passages in the Avatamsaka Sutra that are talking about every atom or every particle samadhi say that, you know, the mind of a Buddha can penetrate every particle of dust and find in that particle of dust the countless worlds that exist in that particle of dust, and find the dust motes that are in those worlds, and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty phantasmagorical and sort of infinity-inducing concept, right? And interestingly, if you look at the Chinese form for what Thomas Clary translates as every atom samadhi, the actual character is the character for dirt or dust, right? So basically, it's like dirt samadhi, okay? But you're really getting way into the dirt with it, and it's good to recognize that probably doesn't happen to people, right? Where physics determines, for the most part, what we can perceive, and even if you decide that there's some metaphysical enhancement to your perception, your brain's just made of meat, right? So how many particles of dust can it see? I don't know, not that many, right? But it's an inspiring idea, right? And that's kind of in some ways the point. Like, there are these two forces pulling on, I was talking about this a little bit before too, but pulling on the sort of Buddhist philosophical and conceptual framework, right? And one of them wants to make things more grand and fantastical, and the other one wants to make them simple, right? And by the time you get to Dogen, who learned his stuff in Song Dynasty China, right? When he talks about samadhi, it's actually, it's Jiju Zanmai. He actually talks about other samadhis as well, but the one he holds up in his like primary discourse, where he's essentially saying this is how everybody should be practicing, is Jiju Zanmai, which is usually translated as self-receiving and employing samadhi. But again, the characters for self-receiving and employing, the receiving and employing part is a compound in Chinese, and it really means enjoying, right? So it's essentially self-enjoying samadhi, right? And that's sort of how it's come down to us today, through the Zen school, right? There's this set of practices that allow us to enjoy and reap the benefits of our humanity. That's really what it says, right? And that allow us to live with our humanity in a way that's skillful and comfortable and doesn't require, eons of playing the karmic lottery and so on. And that's pretty straightforward, right? And that's what the two teachers in the koans are saying too. Like when Sancheng says, what is the net escapee eat, right? What do you think the answer is? They're going to eat rice because they're monks. They're just going to get up every morning and they're going to have rice gruel, and then they're going to have some rice for lunch, and then they'll have some rice maybe with some other stuff mixed in it for dinner. Basically, that's what they're going to have for the rest of their natural life. And the activity that Shuifeng is talking about, he says, my life as an abbot keeps me really busy. That activity is the activity of escaping the net, to the extent that there's a net that you can escape, right? And similarly with Yunmen, right? When the monk asks about every atom samadhi, Yunmen sort of tries to pull him down by saying, "Hey, you floating around up there, come down here." It's eating the rice and hauling the water to cook it, basically. That's it. And so that points to the kind of that points mostly to monastic practice, right? But the interesting thing about that is that by the time Dogen is writing the Bendo Wa, somebody says, well, okay, I mean, as I was saying, back in the day, the assumption was only monks can do this, right? Somebody asks him explicitly, who can do this? And he says, everybody can do it, right? Everyone can benefit from it in the same way. It's just, and he has a fascicle about this as well. It's just easier if you're in a monastery, basically. And, why not, right? So, since everyone can do this, right? Then what are we doing exactly? Becoming aware of our behavior and how it causes difficulty for us and for others, right? Practicing in such a way as to bring forth self-enjoying, benefiting samadhi, right? Reaping the benefits of our human experience, right? And let that guide your engagement. If your life is telling you that something's wrong, believe it, and pay attention to it, just like it's pain in your knee or the sound of a fly flying around the zendo, right? It's just a thing to pay attention to and to register as wholeheartedly as you can, and then live and enjoy the result, basically. So I think I don't close this until we've had questions. Is that right? Or right? Excellent. So, does anybody? One more thing. I wrote a poem for this, so I'll read it. A day like today, when this room is too small to contain anything, when the sky lies low over the horizon like the eye of a startled sleeper, when everyone's wearing their wooden mask or their golden mask, A day like today calls for staying within a yard or two of the ground. It will not abide grand plans or destinations. Not even so much as a pinch of salt could hold together today. So, anyway. That's all I had to say. Does anybody have any questions?
If you have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over.
Hi, Zach.
Hey.
Thank you for your talk. I guess early in the talk, I wondered where it was going, and then it went somewhere different than maybe I thought. And but I still, and there's something about these dualistic metaphors that are as close as we can come to pointing at something. And the one that came to mind is medicine and disease cure one another.
Yeah.
Or similarly, fall down by the ground, stand up by the ground.
Yeah.
And so when you describe suffering as being inherently human, and to be human is to suffer, essentially, those kind of inescapable. I also, it just came to mind that, to practice Buddhism is only a human endeavor. We don't, non-humans don't need Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to put it. Yes, absolutely. Non-humans, as far as we know, don't need Buddhism, right? Because they don't, I mean, well, so why don't you tell me why you think non-humans don't need Buddhism? Because it's a great question. I have a theory about it, but what do you think?
And what I was getting at is that, I mean, we might project the layer of human existence that results in the suffering that we experience, that extra layer of self, reifying a self.
Yeah.
We might project that on animals. We don't really know, but I would kind of posit, at least without knowing 100%, that a fly flying around the zendo is basically existing, and would not need to practice to be awake in the moment and exist in
I think that's largely correct. I mean, you're right. It's hard to know, but I would say the thing that's installed in us that is the source of our overwhelming and incredibly dangerous success as a species, and the cause of the vast majority of our suffering, as we understand suffering, and in particular as Buddha stated suffering, which is to say this sort of fundamental dissatisfaction with life, right? It arises out of our hypertrophied linguistic capacity and our capacity for long-range planning, basically. That's it, right? And so I think I told this story before, but I used to read a lot of neuroscience papers, and there was this one guy named McCracken at UW who did all his work on banana slugs, because you can just walk out the door into the courtyard and go, oh, I'll pick you, and I'll take you back inside, and I'll do experiments on you, which was probably not that great for the banana slugs, but he wrote in one of his papers, he says, banana slugs have all the earmarks of higher thought except a capacity for long-range planning, which I thought was pretty great, right? But it's true, right? No, I think that's correct. do you ever watch crows play? They're amazing. They're totally winning at completely enjoying being crows, as far as I can tell. They do stunt flying. They play tag. It's amazing. They're really great. I've seen this video. I've seen the stunt flying and tag playing in person, but the video, this crow, I think, has like a cafeteria tray or something like that, and he hauls it up to the top of a roof with snow on it, and hops on and slides down, and then he does it again, right? Continuously. It's amazing, right? But they're not transfixed by this massive self-construct that's required to use the language in the way we do, and this massive, heavily loaded conceptual framework that you need to carry in order to use that language, and the long-range planning capacity that arises mostly out of that, right? The ability to tell a story to yourself about what would be good and then pursue it single-mindedly, basically, right? Anyway, something like that. And it's interesting that we project that on fish. It's like you got the fish in the net, right? Yeah, the fish probably doesn't like being netted. I'm sure it doesn't. But for a human, there's no direction that you can swim that gets you out of the net, right? It's a weirdly dualistic and maybe not even super helpful metaphor, right? As many of the metaphors that people cook up when talking about practice are. They're provisionally okay, and then they can be misinterpreted, right? So anyway.
I mean, what does the golden fish eat when it's in the net?
Also rice.
Yeah, that's the question to answer the question. Yeah.
Anyone else?
That's actually all the time we have.
Oh, sorry. I talked too long.
Thank you,
All right.
Zach.
Yeah, thank you.